We have been saying for a number of years now that the reward for knowing what your values are and having the courage to try to integrate those into your daily life, the reward for that is integrity. And by the way, the reward for that is also, it's related, the reward is happiness.
Welcome to Worth Quoting, a program sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville's Open Campus. I'm Carol Spalding, your host, and today we're going to be talking about ethics. And with us is Dr. Bill Grace, who's a husband, a father, and the founder and executive director for the Center for Ethical Leadership. And when we talked about this introduction, and you talked about the husband-father, part of your introduction as being first, it really probably underlines your whole philosophy of values and how you live them out. Is that true?
I think that is true. I like to get introduced as husband and father to, in a way, role model what it means to try to incorporate values into our everyday lives. That values are not something that we sort of discover and put on the shelf, but the challenge is trying to integrate them into each day of our lives. And in all settings, too, you know, trying to be the same person at home as I am in the community and as I am at work.
Most people don't do that, or do they?
I believe that most people want to do that. You know, we don't have a lot of cultural incentives for people to do that. I think we have cultural disincentives, as a matter of fact. I think that people are encouraged, and we can get into this in more detail later, but I do believe that people are encouraged oftentimes to leave their values at home rather than trying to integrate them into their, for instance, professional lives. Mm-hmm. So part of what I try to do is to role model a different way of looking at that.
Okay. Well, there's been a lot of talk about ethics. So why is it a good idea for people to be ethical?
It's a good
and what
question.
Does it even mean?
Well, let me try to get at why is it a good idea by telling a couple stories. We'll come back to what does it mean.
Okay.
The most recent number I've heard on the national debt is that the national debt is somewhere around $5 trillion. But I have no idea what that means. I have no idea what it means to be $5 trillion in debt. I'm fortunate to have a brother who's a physicist and a researcher who's very interested in math. So I asked him, what does it mean to be $5 trillion in debt? And I said, now be kind, because you're talking to somebody who's not as friendly with math as you are. He went away and thought for a bit and came back and said, I think I have an analogy that will work here. And I said, okay, now be kind. He said, let's say that $1 equals 1 second of time. And I said, okay. He said, if that's the case, then 1,000,000 seconds ago was 15 days ago. So we can all sort of imagine where we were 15 days ago. 1 billion seconds ago is 30 years ago. John F. Kennedy had been assassinated a couple years prior. We're getting deeper and deeper into Vietnam. That was 1 billion seconds ago. 1 trillion seconds ago is 30,000 BC. So 5 trillion seconds ago is about 180,000 BC, and according to geologists, that's the middle of the Ice Age. So my question is, what ethics would get us into that situation, into that predicament, where no matter how much we work, we're going to be handing over this deficit to our children? So what must be the dominant ethics underneath the surface of our lives that would allow for that type of reality? And it's my assessment that the dominant ethics that are working sort of underneath the daily activities of our lives are the following. Individualism, for sure, and materialism, and probably elitism. So those three ethics are operating anyway. One of the reasons why we ought to become more conscious of our ethics is so we can make intentional choices about choosing some alternative ethics. For instance, we might trade in materialism for stewardship, or we might trade in individualism for community, or we might trade in elitism for compassion. But if we're going to do that, we have to be conscious of what the ethics are as we speak. then we have to be just as conscious about choosing alternative ethics. So ethics is a way of approaching life sort of wide awake and not letting ourselves be lulled to sleep by the culture, by other dominant forces, institutions and culture, that not out of some sort of intentional evil, but just by their nature, they would have us sort of embrace what is, as opposed to be questioners and shapers of what might be.
So you question and shape what you want yourself to be.
Yeah, I think ethics begins by examining ourselves and trying to get a sense of what values would I like to live my life by. And then those values, ethics is the process by which I integrate those values into my daily life. So values and a philosophy associated with values sort of become the foundation, but ethics are the legs. Ethics is that which I do on a daily basis to incorporate them into my life.
I guess I was thinking that ethics, by definition, meant good things. Like materialism wouldn't be there, but you're saying that ethics is really a framework that you work within, and that you have some choices there. I call it sort of being on automatic pilot. You're saying being wide awake. How do you get to be wide awake?
Well, I think it begins with a reflection process. We're going to put something on the screen here, I think, and the viewers will have a chance to look at a list of values, and the words that they'll see on the screen are a list of 18 words. This is a set of values. It's not a set of values that the Center for Ethical Leadership is trying to promote, but we use it as a sort of a primer to get people thinking about values. The first thing we'd like people to do with the list is to add a couple of values to the list that are values for them that aren't on the list yet. So there's a chance for everybody to personalize the list. But the difficult process begins when they take this list of 18 or 20 and to begin to go through a sorting process. The typical steps that we take people to would be to take this list of 18 or 20 and to reduce it to 10. And if people need more time and have a tape of this, they can stop the tape and reflect on this. But after reducing it to 10, they would then reduce it to 5, and then 3, and then finally 2. And typically when we do this with groups, there's a lot of moaning and groaning when we get to reducing it to 5 and then 3. We like to encourage people not to see themselves as sort of abandoning values by the roadside, but making some relative choices, knowing that some values are relatively more important than others. But getting down to 2 is a very significant challenge, and it might be some of the hardest work that people do in a long time. Once we know what our top 2 values are at the center, we call those core values. Then the question is, those are typically values like love and justice and family and compassion and faith. It's not the exhaustive list, but those are typically some of the values that come up. We really don't try, again, to control what values people choose, but what we do ask them to do is to find ways now to incorporate those values into their daily lives. So when we're working with corporate leaders who oftentimes will come up with values like love and integrity, and so the question for the corporate leaders is, when was the last time you were in the boardroom and the CEO asked, okay, what should we do in relation to this particular problem? When was the last time one of you raised your hand and said, you know, JR, what's the loving thing to do? And typically we get a lot of laughs and chuckles, but you know, the question is, why is it that we're afraid to incorporate love into the workplace? We believe that our culture could be a very different place if we found the necessary courage, I think, to incorporate our values into the workplace. The reward, of course, for doing that, for knowing what your core values are and having the courage to make them a part of your daily life, the reward for that is integrity. That I am the same person at home as I am at work, as I am in the community, and it's not a matter of becoming a different person depending on what suit I'm wearing or what setting I'm in. And again, we don't have a lot of institutions and culture promoting this, so it's very much an individual choice.
So people who know what their core values are could seek out employment, perhaps, that would reflect or be in accord with what their own values are.
Well, that's either one of the fortunate or unfortunate sort of outcomes of some of the work we've been doing around the country as we work with corporate leaders. A number of them have made choices to leave particular corporations because they became more and more conscious that their values were not really fully welcomed in the workplace. What we would prefer is that a person do what's best for their conscience, but we also hope that some people will decide to stay and try to change the culture of a corporation or an institution, and that so choosing an institution that has a good fit for one's values is a good place to begin. Moving to a different institution that has a better sense of alignment with one's values is another good choice. We think an equally good choice is trying to stay and trying to become a change agent within that institution. But that has to be a strategic decision.
How do people find out what the core values are? It sounds like for themselves, they can find out what their core values are by going through this work, this reflection, and having to make forced choices, I guess, of these 18 to 20 values.
Right.
But if you go into a workplace, how do you find out what the core values are of the workplace in a fairly short time, or before you even get there, before you even sign on?
Well, the easiest way, of course, to know what anyone's values are, whether it's an individual or a group, is to watch their behavior. I like to say, if you want to know what my values are, is watch my feet. Rhetoric in and of itself really may or may not shed light on what my values are, but my behavior certainly does. So one of the ways to get a sense for an institution's values is to look at its institutional behavior, before you get there. And I'm sure there's a variety of different ways to do that, including to talking to people during an interview process in that particular institution and asking people what they think the institution's values are. And also, if you happen to be a member of that community, just reflect on and examine, again, institutional behavior and get a sense for what the values must be because of the behavior that's being exhibited. But the purpose of values, again, in our own commitment to values, is to be clear about our own values, and then as we spend time strengthening our own commitments, then we can begin to become concerned about being change agents and helping institutions to grow into greater capacity of integrating a deeper understanding of their own values into the institution's life.
Okay, so you might try and be a change agent or try and live your values out. What happens if you aren't able to gain integrity, that you have to be two different people, one at home and one in the workplace or someplace else?
Well, that's something we've done a little research on. We have been saying for a number of years now that the reward for knowing what your values are and having the courage to try to integrate those into your daily life, the reward for that is integrity. And by the way, the reward for that is also, it's related, the reward is happiness. If you can imagine doing on a daily basis what you think is most important, then the reward for that has got to be happiness. Not happiness as our culture would manifest happiness, drive this car, live in this neighborhood, etc., and you'll be a happy person. But a deeper, more spiritual understanding of what happiness is comes from living a life that is fully integrated. The rewards are easy to talk about. What we began to get curious about is what are the results for living a life that does not have integrity, to have a set of values, but for whatever reason leave them on the doorstep at home because they're too hard to integrate into our daily lives. What we've began to wonder is, what are the costs of that sort of behavior? So again, focusing this time on the corporate sector, we've been taking corporate leaders on retreat and in a pretty safe setting with a small group of peers, we've asked them this question, have you ever been in a position where you have had to leave your values at home in order to perform at the workplace? And by and large, the answer was yes from the majority of participants. And we asked them to think for a while on, did it cost them anything to live in that sort of environment, work environment, for a number of years? And it was much more powerful than we imagined. It had a much more powerful impact Some of the things that were mentioned were minor things like migraine headaches, not minor if you've had migraine headaches, but minor compared to other outcomes. Again, migraine headaches was one. Ulcers was another one that we sort of might predict of living a life that is not fully centered, fully integrated, might cause some discord. But if we look more closely at the word disease, could it be that a lot of our diseases in modern culture come from a sense of a lack of ease that we think is associated with not living a life fully integrated with our values? So some of the other things that the corporate leaders said that they felt was a result of living a life that was disintegrated was heart disease. A couple of the participants talked about how they felt their cancer was related to the life that they were leading, alcoholism, drug use, but also relationships. Many of them talked about costing them their marriage or costing them relationships with their children.
Well, to talk about that, those are heavy prices to pay. I don't think we really look at those kinds of things. But we talk about the idea of integrity, and I think you said that the integrity, what's the basis for that? What's the Greek, the word that, and what does integrity really mean?
Well, I like the roots of words. The root of the word, the root word for integrity is the same as the word for integer. Number meaning a whole number. There's meaning a number without fractions. What we get is wholeness and fullness. But earlier than that, it was a garment industry term, and it meant to be a seamless garment. If a garment was woven on a loom without seam as a whole piece of cloth, then that garment was said to have integrity. And that's a metaphor for us at the center, because that's what we think our lives are supposed to be: seamless garments, woven as whole pieces of cloth. And that's possible. That's possible if we know what our core values are and we try. And this is a lifelong process. I remind people that I don't work at the center of ethical leadership. I work at the center for ethical leadership, which means we're fans of it, but we don't claim to be perfect. And I don't claim to be perfect. But, you know, the struggle of trying to integrate our lives into our values, our values into our lives, that struggle is a good struggle, and the reward for that, again, is integrity and this image of our lives as a whole piece of cloth. Again, the same person at home, in the community, and at work, that no matter where we met, hopefully you would encounter the same person.
Well, I think a lot of people are fans for ethical leadership. I'm not sure we're talking about the same thing that's being tossed around in the media. What is meant when people say ethical or having an ethical group or ethical politicians
Behavior.
Or something, or behavior? Is it meaning the same thing? Your definition is very simple.
Well, I think it's very simple, and it's very intended to be very deep. I worry sometimes that sometimes what we mean by ethics is a much more shallow understanding. I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but I do mean it in a very clear way. That again, when we work with different sectors, if we work with the government sector, for instance, if a government employee is going out to lunch with a potential contractor for the city or the county, they sometimes talk about ethics, is that they can't allow that subcontractor to buy them lunch because that would be possibly perceived as unethical behavior, for a potential contractor to be engaged in. And I would agree that that is unethical behavior. But if that's the limits of the depth of which we're willing to explore, then I think that ethics doesn't serve us as well in culture. Ethics ought to hopefully deepen the reflection in our own lives, and then encourage us to deepen our reflection as we critique culture. I believe it's one of the primary roles of citizen or employee of any enlightened institution. Any enlightened institution ought to be encouraging people who work there to be critics of that institution, believing that that's one of the best ways for that institution, just like people, to mature and grow. I have a friend who says that feedback, not Wheaties, is the breakfast of champions, you know. And institutions and individuals who are open to feedback are likely to grow and mature. So ethics, you know, we ought to be asking ourselves, you know, how is it, and it's back to these foundational ethics that we talked about earlier, materialism and individualism and elitism. Those ethics are the only ethics that can explain for me why we can have a stock market that is doing somersaults, and you know, if it were doing a floor routine in gymnastics, the economy would be getting tens. But in that same economy, 1 in every 4 children are being born into poverty. There's something rotten in Denmark, and if we allow ethics to be harnessed, if you will, and governed in such a way that we only allow it the shallowest reflections, we won't get to the questions, the bigger questions. Eleanor Roosevelt asked a number of years ago, how is it that we can say we're a great culture and a great society when 3/5 of the world is going to bed hungry every night? We need more Eleanor Roosevelts because those statistics, as we speak, are exactly the same. 3/5 of the world still goes to bed hungry every night. Ethics call us to reflect more deeply on what we mean by a healthy economy. When we replace stewardship for materialism, we begin to get closer to the type of social criticism that we need to engage in.
Yeah. Would we all agree on what ethical behavior is?
No, and you know, if someone said, I'm not sure who, that God has a great sense of humor, but is playing to an audience that's afraid to laugh. And you know, my sense is that God must have a great sense of humor, because once we engage in lives that are deeply connected to our values, what we find is that people have different values, or they may have the same value, express value of family and friendship, but they mean different things by family and friendship. So the other thing we need in community is what I call gracious space. Gracious space is the space where strangers feel welcome. There's an educator who I enjoy very much. His name is Parker Palmer. He says that 2 rules automatically fall into place anytime we try to form a community. The number 1 rule is that the last person in the world I'd like to show up in my community shows up. And the second rule is that as soon as I manage to get rid of that person, somebody else comes to take his or her place. So for Parker Palmer, community is about constantly inviting the stranger. And as I think about that in relation to ethics and the different perspectives on ethics, is how can I remain committed to my values while being open to the values of others? And I think that's the mark of a good society, when we have people who are both passionate about what they believe in and yet open to diverse perspectives. And if you can imagine the tension of living that life, there's a sort of creative tension involved in that. And I just think that calls us to be mature citizens. So in addition to wanting people to reflect on ethics, I would also want people to be aware of the importance of conflict resolution and the importance of being a citizen who tries to nurture community. And maybe that's marked in part by, you know, do I have friends who disagree with me? Do I have friends who see the world from different perspectives? If all I do is hang around with people who see the world the way I do, I'm not doing as much to further the sort of civic dialogue that we need among diverse sectors, which is part of what we do at the Center for Ethical Leadership. We try to be what we call a mediating institution. So we bring together leaders from the corporate sector, government sector, religious sector, citizens from low-income neighborhoods, and young people across political persuasions, across age groups, across religious denominations, interfaith connections, and try to ask those people to imagine a community that they'd all like to live in, and then ask them if they would, as citizens, engage in the process of building that community together. So I think it's an important part of the mix, learning how to live together in the midst of our diversity.
We just have about a minute, but what part does courage play in pulling all this together?
Well, my own reflections on this is that courage is essential. And that begs the question, of course, is where does courage come from? The root of this word gives us a little bit of a hint. It's a French word which essentially means from the heart. So courage is something that is not so much an intellectual choice that we make, but it's an emotive choice. It's something that is more from our gut and our heart than it is our head. And I believe that, this is a bold statement, but I believe that there's only really one source of courage with two expressions. And I believe that the one source of courage is relationships. And the two expressions are either community or spirituality. And it comes down to, am I in relationship with someone or something that calls me to my best behavior, that calls me to greatness, that calls me to try to live most deeply out of my values?
All right. Well, thank you very much. So there's a lot to say about ethics, but we appreciate the time you spent with us today.
Thank you very much.
This has been Carol Spalding with Florida Community College and Worth Quoting with Bill Grace, who is husband, father, and the executive director and founder of the Center for Ethical Leadership. Thank you for being with us.